We just had a very nice endorsement from RFK Jr., Bobby. And I'll be talking about that. We're heading out right after this. We're going to be going to Arizona. We'll be talking about that and a lot of other things, too. But I just want to thank everybody. And I want to thank Bobby. That was very nice. That was really very nice. That's big. He's a great guy, respected by everybody.
Emergency video because it is now official. RFK Jr. will be dropping out of the presidential race and endorsing Donald Trump. And his speech itself, by the way, was phenomenal. It was unifying, and it truly was a scathing indictment of the modern Democrat Party. And perhaps that is the reason that mainstream media networks like CNN literally cut away from the speech as it started happening. Check it out.
At the palace coup against President Biden, the same shadowy DNC operatives appointed his successor, also without an election. They installed a candidate who was so unpopular with voters that she dropped out in 2020 without winning a single delegate. My uncle and my father both relished debate. They prided themselves on their capacity to go toe-to-toe with any opponent in the battle over ideas. They would be astonished to learn of a Democratic Party presidential nominee who, like Vice President Harris, has not appeared in a single interview or an unscripted encounter with voters for 35 days.
We've been listening to independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from Phoenix outlining what led him to his quixotic quest for the White House to now dropping out and relinquishing the title of Democrat. He had a series of
So yeah, and if you watch the speech, you would know that this part where he's calling out the Democrat Party for its basically rigged primary process was at the very beginning of his speech. So it's not like, oh, they let it play for some time and then they're going to cut away. No, immediately, the moment he starts calling out Kamala Harris, the party, all of that, immediately CNN cuts away. And I think it's fair to say, based on that indication, that Democrats are in full-blown panic mode over this development. They may not mention it. They're pretending like it's not a big deal. We're glad RFK is on Trump's side. But when you take a look at the state of the election and how this impacts it, that is obviously not true. But we'll talk about that later in the video. Firstly, I want to address the actual reasons that RFK publicly said he is dropping out and endorsing Trump, because they obviously found agreement on things like government corruption or the war in Ukraine. But specifically, RFK lists out that while it was not an easy decision for him, Donald Trump and RFK obviously have been having talks and negotiations over the past couple weeks. But specifically, the role that Trump offered RFK was a chance to tackle the childhood chronic disease epidemic and a lot of the screwed up stuff in our health system, and especially the food system that is poisoning our country, that is causing so many problems, not just for our kids, but for Americans in general. It's an issue I think is so important, and apparently now, according to them, in the next Trump White House, this will be an issue that RFK Jr. is tasked to address. Take a listen.
To suspend my campaign and to support President Trump. This decision is agonizing for me because of the difficulties it causes my wife and my children and my friends. But I have the certainty that this is what I've meant to do. And that certainty gives me internal peace, even in storms. If I'm given the chance to fix the chronic disease crisis and reform our food production, I promise that within 2 years, we will watch chronic disease burden lift dramatically. We will make Americans healthy again. Within 4 years, America will be a healthy country. We will be stronger, more resilient, more optimistic, and happier.
So there you heard it. RFK essentially goes on after this to say that while he didn't really want to drop out of the race, he sees this as his life mission, right? If he can get in there, save some kids' lives, fix the national health crisis in our country, that's more than worth it, and that is bigger and that's more unifying than any ideological differences that he may have with Trump, which is a truly powerful statement. I think really a patriotic decision to make. You know, this has been his life mission. He's going going to pursue that. But by the way, I also think it is something that is so important, right? The food system in our country, the way that Americans are so sick and obese and unhealthy, all the chronic disease issues with our kids. This is obviously never something that Trump has addressed or made his message about, but the fact that RFK in a second Trump White House, according to their little agreement here, will be tackling that, will be addressing that, so important beyond politics, just for the future of our country and our kids, et cetera, et cetera. But what I found to be especially so striking about the entire situation was the way in which this all happened, because RFK talks about the difference in how he was treated by Trump versus treated by Kamala Harris, right? Donald Trump was willing to pick up the phone, willing to talk and listen to RFK, willing to find very interesting points of agreement that they never knew they had. And by contrast, RFK notes the arrogance of Kamala Harris and how she refused to ever meet with RFK, ever pick up the phone, ever even hear out what he had to say. And in the end, this is what made the big difference in RFK ultimately teaming up with Trump instead of potentially maybe teaming up with his old party, of course, the Democrats. So take a listen to this. I think it is so important. Check it out.
Series of long, intense discussions, I was surprised to discover that we are aligned on many key issues. In those meetings, he suggested that we join forces as a unity party. We talked about Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals. That arrangement would allow us to disagree publicly and privately and fiercely, if need be, on issues over which we differ, while working together on the existential issues upon which we are in concordance. I was a ferocious critic of many of the policies during his first administration, and there are still issues and approaches upon which we continue to have very serious differences. But we are aligned with each other on other key issues like ending the forever wars, ending the childhood disease epidemics, securing the border, protecting freedom of speech, unraveling the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, getting the U.S. intelligence agencies out of the business of propagandizing and censoring and surveilling Americans and interfering with our elections. Following my first discussion with President Trump, I tried unsuccessfully to open similar discussions with Vice President Harris. Vice President Harris declined to meet or even to speak with me. Suspending my candidacy is a heart-rending decision for me, but I'm convinced that it's the best hope for ending the Ukraine war and ending the chronic disease epidemic that is eroding our nation's vitality from the inside, and for finally protecting free speech. I feel a moral obligation to use this opportunity to save millions of American children above all things.
So you heard that, right? Kamala Harris refused to talk to RFK, refused to sit down with him and hear out what he had to say. And even now, many of her surrogates are celebrating that decision. For instance, Victor Shi, our good friend here, says, I respect Kamala Harris even more now for not meeting with RFK Jr. Bravo. Kamala's wins on Twitter tweeted out, breaking, RFK Jr. just announced that Kamala Harris refused to even meet with him. Retweet. So all Americans see this and know Kamala Harris is already putting her incredible decision-making abilities on display. And like I said, the utter arrogance and hubris of this is truly off the charts, because this is a decision that genuinely could cost Kamala Harris a close election. We've seen this in the polls, which is ever since they made the candidate switch, RFK Jr. was taking votes away from Donald Trump. For instance, we had a general election poll released in August that says, with RFK Jr. on the ballot, and this is just one example, there's many examples, Harris led Trump by 2 points. But without RFK Jr., Trump led Harris by 2 points, right? So RFK Jr. being on the ballot was was something of a saving grace for Kamala and something that could have cost the election for Donald Trump. But instead of addressing that, instead of thinking, okay, maybe we need to meet down with RFK and make sure he's helping us or whatever it is, they totally disregarded him. And take a look now. Following this insane blunder by the Kamala Harris campaign, the Trump campaign released this internal poll showing how the RFK Jr. vote will split in favor of Trump. So you take a look, for instance, in Arizona. Currently, RFK Jr. is getting 5% of the vote. And with him off the ballot, Trump will now receive 53% of RFK's potential voters. Harris will only get 28%, and undecided is 19%. So that is a net of 25% of RFK's potential voters going to Trump. Is that a huge margin in the grand scheme of things? No, but we obviously know that in a close battleground state, that could make all the difference. So take a look at these margins. Net 25% in Arizona, a net of 13% of RFK's potential voters in Georgia, 2% in Michigan, 36% in North Carolina, 50% in Nevada. That's a whole 2% of the electorate here, 13% in Pennsylvania, and 30% in the state of Wisconsin. And so you're taking a look at these numbers and you're saying, with the exception of Michigan and maybe Pennsylvania and Georgia, in all these other swing states, these are margins that are more than enough to decide the very election itself. Kamala Harris made a huge mistake not picking up the phone, but the insane show of arrogance again by the Kamala Harris campaign, by the way, is not just something that is confined to this one decision. I look at both of these campaigns and I see this trend generally, which is that the Democrats are incredibly arrogant. I'll give you a couple of examples for that. Their DNC just wrapped up yesterday. They spent the vast majority of that convention not even trying to appeal to independent voters, right? They just thought, hey, if we double down on our base, if we double down on the people that already support us, we don't have to make an outreach to new voters. That'll win us the election. And they certainly hope they're right on that. But that is fundamentally cocky. That is fundamentally arrogant to think that you don't need to make an outreach to new voters. At the same time, they also held their convention in Chicago, which is a deep blue city and a deep blue state, whereas the Republicans held theirs in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right? Republicans actually did the convention in a swing state. Democrats thought that wasn't necessary. They thought it was necessary to not have a Palestinian or Palestinian activist actually speak at the DNC. And you saw yesterday a lot of Muslim activists voice their outrage at that. And now this fundamental difference in decision making, when Donald Trump decided to pick up the phone and hear out RFK, Kamala Harris refused to do that. Another thing that could just make the tiniest difference that decides this election. And that's the huge contrast I see between these campaigns. Trump is willing to focus on the little things where Kamala Harris isn't, right? And we've seen this more than just the RFK thing. We saw this when Trump spoke at the Bitcoin convention. He spoke at the Libertarian convention. He's doing these interviews with Logan Paul, Aiden Ross, right? Tiny miniature things that are not going to make the biggest difference in the election, but those little things add up. The Trump campaign is focused on them. They believe they're important. Kamala, again, is so arrogant and cocky. She doesn't think that they're necessary. And come November, their arrogance, their hubris may come back to bite them, because especially this RFK thing, as we showed you here in the polls, more than enough to make the deciding difference in this election if it comes down to the wire. That said, folks, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.